Okay, this is section number 1, which is square and square roots. You're going to have to make sure that you know how to use your calculator for this part of the test. And question number 1 says, circle which point is closest to the square root of 28 on the number line. So you want to remember in your calculator, you're going to hit the control and then the x squared. So your x squared is this one right here. So control x squared will give you that square root symbol, and then you enter into the 28. When you find the square root of 28, it's going to be 5.2915. And when we look at our number line, here's the number 5, just a little bit past 5, so that's going to be letter B. Question 2 says, between which two consecutive values is the square root of 85? Draw and label a number line to illustrate. So you have to remember that the word consecutive means numbers one right after the other. So again, we're going to use that calculator, and we're going to do the control x squared to get the square root sign, and we want to do the square root of 85. When we do that, it's going to be 9.219. And so we're going to put a number line, and I have the number 9 right here, so that's going to be the first number that I stick on that number line. And then I'm going to put the number before and the number after. Okay? Now, remember, if this happened to be a negative on the outside, everything's backwards. Make sure you line your numbers up correctly. Now, that's going to be 9. It's about 9 2/10. So I'm going to go a little past 9. So it's going to be about right there. And when I label that, I'm going to put my original number. So that's the square root of 85. Number 3 says, if the index is 4 and the radicand is 78, what is the root? And round to the nearest hundredths. So we're going to come back to this in a second to talk about your place values. But you want to remember that the index is this point right here. This is your index. Okay, and then the radicand is going to be the inside part. So when we set this up right here, we're going to have an index of 4 and a radicand of 78. When we enter that in our calculator, it's a little bit different now. So you're going to take that calculator, and it's going to be the control and this power up, or the arrow up. That's going to be, it's going to give you, if you look right here, that where we can do a different index. So that's the button we're going to use. And when you enter that into the calculator, you're going to get 2.97183. The calculator only has a certain amount of space, so that's why that number stopped. And the hundredths place value is where the 7 is. So you want to look at the place value right after that, and that's going to tell you what that number does. Well, the 1 does not have enough to bump the 7, so it's going to stay a 7, and the answer to this would be 2.972 and 97 hundredths. All right, so we're going to explain the differences between some sets and subsets of real number system, and we're going to write and complete sentences. All right, so we want to know the difference between a rational number versus an irrational number. Let me erase these little dots here. All right, so a rational number, using numbers or pictures. Rational number is fractions. So you can have positive or negative fractions. You can have decimals. You can have decimals that repeat. So this is a terminating decimal. This is a decimal that repeats. That is okay. Now your irrational numbers, so those are your rational. Irrational numbers are numbers like pi, 0.128, goes on forever. You have non-perfect square roots. So if we were to justify this in writing, we could say a rational number can be written in fraction form can be positive or negative, or can be a decimal that terminates or repeats. So you want to remember anytime you have a fraction, that's going to be a rational number. Fractions always go with your rational numbers. And now we're going to do a definition for irrational. Irrational numbers never end and never repeat. They go on forever and ever, never ending and never repeating. Okay, let's look at the next one, which is going to be perfect square versus the non-perfect square or the imperfect square. So we'll start with the perfect square root. That's like the square root of 16, which is 4, or the square root of 25, which is 5. Your imperfect squares are going to be the square root of 17. So if I was to put that in the calculator using the Control X squared button, that would give me 4.2 and so on. If I did the square root of 23, it's going to give me 4.7 and so on. These numbers never end and they never repeat. They're going to keep going and going, which also makes them irrational. So if we were to do in words over here, we could say a perfect square is the product of a number times itself. And you're going to end up here with a whole number as your answer. That's how you know if it's a perfect square. You end up with the whole number. And if it's an imperfect square, an imperfect square is an integer whose square root is not a whole number. So an imperfect square is an integer whose square root is not a whole number. All right, now let's look at natural versus integer. Okay, so we're going to have a natural number, which is like your 1, 2, 3, 4, so on. And then you have your integer, which would be like -2, -1, 0, 3, 5. Okay? Now we're going to put this in words using complete sentence. Natural numbers are all positive numbers. So that's all your positive numbers. And your integers are all positive and negative whole numbers. These cannot be fractions or decimals. That's where that whole number comes in there. It's got to be a positive or negative whole numbers. All right, 5 says a non-perfect square is between 20 and 30. Which one could be the root? So the root is like the answer to your square root. So if I was to take 4 squared, that would be 16, because the square root of 16 is 4. And I'm looking for one that's in between 20 and 30. So I'm going to figure out what each of these are squared and see what I'm working with. So 5 squared is 25, 6 squared, 36, 7 squared, 49. Now if you forget how to do that in your calculator, this is your square root. Do not push control first. Don't do that. Just hit this one and it will give you your answer. If you want a different power, like let's say 5 to the power of 3, you would first push 5 to the power of 3. And that will give you that different exponent. All right, so we're looking between one of 20 and 30. 25 is between 20 and 30, so 5 squared is 25, which is between 20 and 30. And you didn't have to write that, but that's what we did there. All right, next page. We're going to complete this table. And a couple of things to remember here. You want to remember this index, this index is also going to be your exponent when we're setting it up over here using the index and the root. We're going to write an expression equivalent. That's going to be your exponent that you're using. And then the root will be the answer, which we want to round to the nearest hundredths place value. So remember, you have your tenths, your hundredths, and your thousandths place value. We're going to take this one and round to that one right there. All right, so in your calculator, you want to remember you want to do control and then the power symbol, control to the power of, and that's going to give you, where did I put this calculator? When we do that control to the power of, it's going to give you that index that I can change. You'll have that double blinking box. So you enter that in your calculator. Make sure your index is 4 and 625 is your radicand. And when you do that, you're going to get the number 5. There's your root. So then we take the root here and the index, and we're saying, what does that mean? Well, that's 5 to the power of 4, which is really like 5 times 5 times 5 times 5. 5 to the power of 4. All right, the next one, we're going to take the square root of 60. So in this case, we're going to do the control, and it's the x squared so that we can get that square root symbol. And when you enter that in there, you're going to get 7.745, and it's going to keep going. And it says to round to the nearest hundredth, so I'm going to look at the third place value, which is going to tell that 4 I have enough to bump you up. And so this is going to be about 7.75. And that's the number we're going to use as our root. You also want to remember here, if there's no number here, no number means the number really is 2, because it's the square root. So we're going to take this root and this index, and we're going to make it become the exponential form. So 7.75, 7 and 75 hundredths squared, which really means 7.75 times 7.75. All right. Make sure if you have any questions that you ask before your test. Good luck.